the Serenity Prayer, and then I'll talk for a little bit, and then Tim will talk for a little bit, and then maybe we can take some questions. We have a long period of time today, so I could talk for 5 hours straight without taking a breath, and that's not a virtue. So it's good to break it up and have different energy, as we would say in California. But why don't we start with the Serenity Prayer? God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I'm Tom. I'm an alcoholic. I'm very glad to be in the Al-Anon community. What happens a lot at meetings, if you go regularly, is you get to know people. We share experience, strength, and hope. We learn to tell our stories. And a lot of the power of the AA and Al-Anon literature is it's lots of stories. It comes out of the experience of people. And usually you don't get patronized. People talking down to you, or you don't get ordered around, or you don't get lectures about what you should be doing. Although I've been to meetings where all those things have happened. But as sharing of experience, strength, and hope, and the program comes out of the experience of an awful lot of people. A lot of people from all over the world. There's a vital book on religious stuff by an American psychologist and physician named William James. He's a big guy, teaches at Harvard University in 1905, he goes to Glasgow in Scotland and gives a series of lectures, which are written down and published, and they're called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And it was remarkable for several reasons. Number one, as a medical person, they're inventing psychology. They don't quite know how to, but they're making it up. They're trying things out. A lot of early psychology or medicine could be very hostile to religious stuff, figuring it's delusional or signs of mental illness or wrong. We're the smart people that don't believe. Believers are dumb. All that. William James' book is nothing like that. He takes people seriously. And when they say they're having religious experience, he would say, tell me, what were you like, what happened, and what you're like now. He does a lot of personal interviews. He also does a fair amount of research. And he puts together this book that has lots of details. He looks at the East, he looks at the West, he looks at historical groups, he looks at cultural groups. There's a whole chapter on what saintliness looks like or what holiness looks like. It's very interesting to read. And he comes down to this. Now, I think you should still read the book, but let me condense it to 100 words. People have lots of experiences like this. And there's a wide variety of experiences like this. There's not just one way fits all. There's a variety of religious or spiritual experiences. Some are very dramatic and sudden, and some are slow and gradual and educational, and there's lots in between. In some communities, I think when I'm dealing with people I would refer to as fundamentalists, the basic thing of the fundamentalist is there's only one way to do things, namely my way. So I know fundamentalist vegetarians and fundamentalist Catholics and fundamentalist members of Alcoholics Anonymous. There's only one way to do this. There are so many ways, some quick, some slow, some very dramatic, some pretty boring. And what this is his last point in his book, What most people care about is they'd like to have something that works. They want something that's real practical. And that's one of the benefits of the 12-step programs. They're very practical. William James. Bill Wilson is given this book, and he probably skims it. He skimmed a lot of things. He was very bright. And he makes reference to it in the end of the big book when he's talking about the spiritual experience or the religious experience. There are so many ways this happens. And I like that. The language that's also used is having had a spiritual awakening, a waking up, because we're doing the work of the program. We wake up. And there was an argument, a discussion, a conversation. Should we talk about spiritual awakening or spiritual experience? And people divided on that. But they're both good words. We wake up, and we wake up to discover there's a lot of work to do. I don't wake up quickly, and I don't wake up friendly most times. Where am I, and what am I doing, and oh my God, I'm still alive. Those are kind of my first three thoughts. In early recovery, the first 5 or 6 years, there was some formation of traditions. We'll talk about steps and traditions today. We'll go back and forth on this. In the preface to the first edition, it says, Roman numeral 13, we are not an organization in the conventional sense of the word. There are no fees or dues whatsoever. We figure by the time you've gotten here, you've paid your dues. You're ready. The only requirement for membership is an honest desire to stop drinking. In the Al-Anon tradition number 5, which I'll refer to later, it'll say you just need to have a friend or a family member who's breaking your heart, who's in trouble, who's drowning in booze, and then we're glad to see you. Now, an honest desire to stop drinking. That got changed. In more recent interpretations, they just say not an honest desire, but just a desire to stop drinking. And I know I've been to meetings where people argued about that, of course, because people argue about everything. It's one of the things, What we discovered is some people come in with terrible attitudes and they can still get sober. You don't need a pure, honest, noble, dignified, refined desire to stop drinking. If you have a sleazy, awful, selfish one that's full of fear and bigotry, it can work. So we take you where you are, not where you could be if only you were better and tried harder. Okay. So a desire, any desire, even a little bit. And then it says, we are not allied with any particular faith, sect, or denomination. And that's real important to say, because we don't want to get involved in those arguments. As you might know, sometimes some of us who are religious people can have fistfights in the parking lot over all kinds. We don't want to go there. I mean, you can, but let's not today, okay? We want to avoid that. We're not allied, nor do we oppose anyone. We simply wish to be helpful to those who are afflicted. And then there's a lot of experience before officially the 12 traditions are formulated. For a long time in New York, people who were attending meetings and had questions or problems, they'd write New York, and Bill Wilson would answer letters. There's thousands of Bill Wilson letters. And there were other people who would answer letters, and you find out all kinds of things. But through that correspondence, you found out what the difficulties were. And the traditions are to help us around the difficulties. Almost done. What is true is that human beings are argumentative and cranky, and we don't get along. That's simply true. Knowing that, we have to find a way of getting along. And the traditions develop so we can do that. There's some studies that indicate that they're really happy about the 12 steps, but they think in terms of social welfare, the 12 traditions are more significant because they help difficult people live together.
My name is Tim. I'm an alcoholic and an Al-Anon and some other unspeakable things. I started a group many years ago now with a couple of friends, and we started it in accordance with the traditions, the handbook, a couple of concepts, the pamphlet, the AA group. We really did our homework and we organised it very well, and it worked very, very well for a number of years. But the funny thing about the traditions, and I've seen this such a lot, is behind them is a spirit. And the spirit is I think it was it Mary Pearl or Blanche? One of the two in Al-Anon would say that applying tradition 3 to a marriage, the only requirement is the desire to be in the marriage and to make it work. And we had all sorts of good ideas which worked very well when the spirit was very good in the group. So what people would do, for instance, if you had a service, it was a big group, 80, 90, 100 people, and we had workshops as well as the meeting, and it was all very organised. And we wrote down the job descriptions so that the experience would be passed from person to person. So when someone came in to do the secretary role or the treasury role or the literature, all the things that the previous person had learned were then passed on. So it became collective experience. And that was in line with this idea and the concepts that when you get into a role, you want to be briefed. You don't want to be thrown into the swimming pool and have to learn to swim whilst you're trying to save other people's lives at the same time. You want to give people the tools to do the job they're asked to do. I think it's concept 11. I haven't done my homework for the concepts tomorrow. And it was great. So when someone came into a role, all the funny little tips and quirks. If the fire alarm goes off, this is what you do. When you're the social secretary, you want to make sure that the restaurant we go to is cheap, is nearby, where you don't have to book. They don't care if people keep changing seats. They don't care if 4 people just drink water. They're just happy. So some basic tips. It worked really well. And then over the years, and this is just between me and Tom and you and the 50,000 people that hear this on the podcast. But so just between us, the group, as my other half would say, went on a journey. And that's what my other half describes it, when people are struggling with something. He says, well, he's on a journey. That means, don't give him the keys to to the venues because he's on a journey right now. The group went on a journey, and that beautiful little thing where people just quietly passed on experience. And there are other things around turning up for service assignments. If you didn't turn up for a few weeks, we just give it to someone else, very relaxed. We just got on with it. So we had some ideas and some principles for how the group would operate, which came from the traditions, which came from the concepts. It was all very well done. But the group went on a journey, and what happened is what had started off as spirited and spontaneous turned military. And people started getting officious little emails to say, you haven't turned up to your service 3 times in a row. We deem this to be a resignation. And unless you signal your willingness to continue the whole thing. And it got so poisonous. The problem was not the system, the problem was the spirit with which the system was being implemented. There were people with agendas, and not everyone wanted to get on. And one person actually said, "This is a disciplined group." And they wanted to make it a disciplined group. And it could have got very nasty. And what happened, a few weeks in a row, a few people just in the group meeting, not even in a business meeting or a group conscience, shared about principles of live and let live. And let it be. It wasn't an AA meeting, it wasn't an Al-Anon meeting, but people used the Al-Anon slogan, let it begin with me. And keeping my big fat mouth shut. And minding my own business. And looking after my own program. And something clicked. And people figured out that was not what they wanted. And a few people left very suddenly, and then it all relaxed again. And now the atmosphere is completely different. And sometimes I'm a bit wary when I'm asked to speak on the traditions or the concepts. Sometimes you get the feeling that people want ammunition so they can go into a business meeting and a group conscience armed to more effectively get their own way and force through agendas. And I know because I was like that. And I'm not very interesting or unique, so I know other people do the same. And I've talked to people. You can sort of feel when that is the case. And there's a wonderful line in the traditions about obedience to the unenforceable, which means that if the group goes too far off beam, people are just not going to want to come and put money in the pot. You can't pay the rent, the group folds. If people find the group helpful, people will come, people will put the money in the pot, the group continues. If I don't continue to take personal inventory and tell people the truth in a bumbling way, and I don't help people, I'm going to get drunk. There's no one standing over me, waving their finger, saying, you must do this. It's my own knowledge of when I get too close to the edge, I start to get burned. When a group gets too close to the edge, it starts to get burned. And it's that feeling that you're near the edge, which certainly for me, pulls me back. So the traditions and the concepts, they're great, but they're principles that I want to try and use to solve situations in a harmonious way. And just one last point before I hand back to Tom. My other half and I, we don't argue. We have occasional discussions, and there are times when both of us have to be silent. But we don't argue, and we've talked about this. And our view, it sort of came from him really, was that we want to keep it simple, and we want to have a nice time together. We don't want to argue. We don't want to fight. So we find a way of resolving everything without resorting to argument and fighting. And the reason this is relevant is the traditions are simply ideas that can be applied. They're not laws. And I've seen very often you have opposite positions on a particular question. Good example, discussion at fellowship last night. If someone is disrupting a meeting by crossing people's physical boundaries, shall we say, and trying to make sexual advances or being violent or threatening violence, how do you handle it? Do you exclude them ultimately from the group for a period of time? Do you keep them in the room? You can argue either point with the traditions if you try hard enough. So it's not about using the traditions to bolster a psychological position. It's about helping me give me principles by which my conscience can operate. But it's all in the sense of wanting a recovery that works, a group that works, and a fellowship that works, where everyone can be in a room together and no one needs to get into fights. So that's enough for me.
The Al-Anon tradition that I referred to is number 5. Each Al-Anon family group has but one purpose: to help families of alcoholics. We do this by practicing the 12 steps of AA ourselves, by encouraging and understanding our alcoholic relatives, and by welcoming and giving comfort to families of alcoholics. So the action words here are practicing, encouraging, understanding, welcoming, and giving comfort. Thus the groups form. There's legend. AA is in operation for some years before Al-Anon gets going. In the AA text, there's a chapter entitled Two Wives. It was not written by a wife. A wife wrote it, and then Bill Wilson said, "What do you know?" And so he rewrote it. So it basically comes down to stand by your man. That's the chapter to wives. There's also some helpful things in there about self-care and families and so forth, but it's not really from a wife's point of view. And not for the first time, women were kind of left out in the cold. So here's the legendary story. This may be 60% true, but I like it. So, with all those warnings, it's in New York. Bill W. is having an AA meeting with black coffee drinking, donut eating, cigarette smoking alcoholics in recovery. And they're in the kitchen, I guess, or the front room, and they're laughing and they're talking and they're drinking black coffee and eating donuts and smoking cigarettes and laughing and talking. Lois is upstairs. And let's say it's a cold and rainy night. And she looks out and she sees a dozen cars parked out there. And in each car, there's a person. The wives. And she goes out and goes up to the first car and knocks on the window and says, "Are you as angry as I am?" "Oh, yes. Why don't we have a gathering?" The fantasy is that when the drinking stops, everything just gets better right away. And it takes a long time for programs to emerge and develop and find their own voice. Al-Anon does not echo AA. It's parallel and cooperative, but it's its own voice. I was sober for several years before I went to my first Al-Anon meeting. I was at a weekend of recovery. Women and men were present, many couples. And I heard a man talk. His wife was the alcoholic. And I heard him talk, and I heard him say, in Al-Anon, I learned how to live with a crazy person and not go crazy. And I felt crazy. I was teaching high school kids, and I felt crazy. I was reacting to basic high school, ordinary high school stuff. And it's simply true to say an awful lot of high school students act like alcoholics. It's also true to say a lot of alcoholics act like high school kids. I mentioned this at an Al-Anon meeting, and one of the other people present was a teacher who taught third graders. And she came out to me and said, my experience is a lot of third graders act like alcoholics, and a lot of alcoholics act like third graders. So it's controversial. But as a teacher, I just felt overwhelmed. I burned out teaching because I didn't have protection, I didn't have self-protection, I didn't have boundaries, I didn't have common sense. And so I played with Al-Anon for a little while. And I went to a meeting in Los Angeles. It's a famous meeting. All Los Angeles meetings think they're famous meetings, just between us. I sat in the back with a couple other men, and there were a number of women in the room, by being 20, 25. And the person who was secretary had been secretary for several hundred years. And she knew everything. And she was full of wisdom and power and authority. And they read all the stuff. Al-Anon meetings can have a lot of reading. They want to cover a lot of bases before they start. And then here's what happened at the meeting. If you had a problem, you presented it to Her Majesty. And she solved it. And then another person would present a problem to Her Majesty. And she solved it. Now, I went to this meeting 5 or 6 times. The person giving advice, giving answers, and running the meeting had a lot to say. She was not stupid. She had a lot of experience, but that's not Al-Anon. One of our crazinesses is giving advice and running other people's lives. You should get a divorce, you should get married, you should move in, you should move out. Your kid should do this, your kid should do that. We're experts on everyone's life. And what we do, rather than me telling you what to do, although I've done it a zillion times. I have practiced medicine without a license. I have practiced family counseling without a family. I just can't help myself, especially when you're pathetic. Let me help you. I was San Francisco. This is a little footnote vignette to show you the depth of my depravity. San Francisco has a great big airport, like many places, and I was lost in the San Francisco airport somewhere in a parking structure, and it's like being lost in the Great Pyramid. I mean, you don't know, there's signs, but and I was running around lost and confused, and there was a woman, I'm guessing in her 30s, and then perhaps her mother, and they were speaking a foreign language, I don't know which one, but they too were lost, and clearly panicky and confused. So I thought I'd help them. Now, I don't know where I am. I don't know where I'm going. But I walked up to these two lost people. Can I help you? I just want to help you, although I'm the last person who could help. And they ran for their lives. They picked up that vibration of, this is a crazy person. But that instinct to help even when helping is not possible, I'm like that. So here's what we do in Al-Anon. It's the Al-Anon voice. I share my experience with you. I do not tell you what your experience should be. It's a world-changing difference. That's also, I think, true in AA. At least for me. I've learned to tell my own experience. I sponsor several people. Several are married. I'm not married. I do not give marriage advice. Although, again, don't repeat this, but sometimes having listened to the spouse, I'm really glad I'm not married. I don't know if you've ever had that experience. And then some have kids, and I don't have kids, and I don't I tell them to talk to other parents. I mean, that you have to talk to parents. Go see a doctor. Have you been to a physician? But I'm really glad regularly, too, that I don't have kids, because evidently for the first 5 years of a child's life, no one sleeps. And I find that unpleasant. So I'm regular. Anyway, that's off the topic. I learned to share my experience and my strength and my hope. And if you come to me with a conundrum, with a paradox, with a crisis, with an issue, I can share with you how I've experienced that or worked with that. I don't tell you what to do. And therefore the focus is on recovery, and I try to stay away from a lot of controversial issues. Learning how to speak Al-Anon, knowing that some of us have advice for the whole world. And that's the craziness. That meeting, it still may be going, I don't know, it's been many years since I've been there again. But it was run like a very well-organized cult. And you'll hear people talk about program and recovery being cultish, and I have been to meetings where it smelled a little cultish, but most of us are far too disorganized to be cultish. If you follow the traditions, it's not a cult.
My first real home group, there were lots which I tried out, but there was one which felt very much like home for the first 10 years. And for a few years after that, I was in and out of that meeting. Now, in some ways, it was hopeless because there was very little discussion of the programme. But in many ways, I think it was an exemplary AA group. We did hold group conscience meetings, but only when there was a problem which needed to be solved. We didn't hold them every 5 minutes with people queuing round the block with their list of proposals, like Martin Luther with his, however many it was,
97.
97.
I think, yeah.
Reformers, as it says in the big book, who think the world would be great if only everyone else would shape up. I didn't care at that group. If there was a problem, once there was someone who was struggling with some of the basics of life and wasn't bathing as often as most of us wanted him to, and it was noticed. He'd walk into the room would fill with, and it was now that's something which needed to be dealt with. We need to have a discussion, and I think it was dealt with very kindly, but it was dealt with. When there was a problem, we had a discussion, but otherwise we just got on with it. And at the other end of the scale, I've got to be so careful, Tim, be very careful. Don't say what you're going... I'm going to say it anyway. I went to a meeting in one of the 50 states, which was very, very organised, with plastic birthday cakes and thousands of people doing the tea, and everyone looked very smart. So the women had skirts and the men
And why did they have plastic birthday cakes?
So they could recycle them week after week.
It's very practical. You just have to buy one.
Yes. Very good.
It's not for eating, it's for seeing.
There you go. Perfect. And everyone was dressed very, very smartly. The women in skirts and dresses, the men in suits or smart casual, I think is the term. Now, in my home group, we'd have trouble working out who are the men, who are the women, in order to tell them which one to wear. And people, 1 week it's one name, the next week it's another name. You have to keep flashcards for the pronouns. It's very complicated. So we wouldn't be able to do that because, anyway, but this group had found a way to navigate that, and it was all very organised, and there were lots of announcements, and there were lots of birthdays, and it felt like this huge Fabergé egg, and inside you open up the top, and inside is just half a boiled egg. There was nothing to eat there. It wasn't my sort of Now, it's very popular, hundreds of people go, so obviously it must be doing something for them or they wouldn't go. So fine, if they want to do that one, but it's not my taste. I'd rather have a wonderful meal at someone's kitchen table than go to a fancy restaurant with all of the hoogemaflip, but a dull little dry meal. I'd rather have something which is made with love and there's too much of everything. And it's very amateurish and very homey. And this group, in the first 10 years, it was very homey. There were very clearly people who would not mix. You would not expect to see those people together. When we went out for fellowship afterwards, we'd be in a cafe and people would walk into the cafe and they'd see the table we were sitting at and they would double take because there was clearly something going on. Waiting staff would say, "Who are you?" And to borrow someone else's phrase, it looked like the bar from Star Wars, if anyone remembers the bar from Star Wars. And what that meant was that no one could be kicked out and everyone was welcome. There wasn't a group way of doing things. And one thing I've learnt about Tradition 1 is that unity and uniformity don't go together. That for the group to be unified, I've got to be okay with people doing things radically differently than me, and sometimes doing them radically differently than me and doing better than me. When I think they shouldn't. They should be drinking by now with a programme like that. But no, they're thriving somehow. And now, one of the difficult things, when you've got a meeting where everyone is, as it were, singing from the same hymn sheet, everyone is saying the same thing. I went to a meeting once where everyone said, when they shared, and, when I got to AA, I was full of pitiless and incomprehensible demoralisation, but I found a man who was armed with the facts, and it was mostly men at this meeting. 9 out of 10 people at this meeting were men. That's always a sign of something in my experience in AA. There's something funny going on if women don't want to go. There's an atmosphere there. And everyone said, and I got myself a sponsor and I worked the steps, and my recommendation to any newcomer would be to get a sponsor and work the steps, and there'd be a certain other little catchphrases and jingles that they would use. And by the time I was into the third, you're hearing the third share, you know what they're going to say because everyone's been prepped for what they're going to say. And I was so bored. I'm rarely bored in an AA meeting. But I was bored in that meeting. You couldn't fault a thing that was being said. But it was all technically accurate, but I couldn't feel it. I felt nothing. But in a meeting which is real, I'm going to hear things which make me feel really, really uncomfortable because they touch stuff, they touch issues or questions I don't want to look at ever, or maybe not just yet. People with radically different views on topics that I have settled positions on. And I get to, on a good day, be tolerant and say my piece without it being a confrontation. But even without saying, well, you should do this and I think people should do that, sometimes you say, well, my experience is, well, if I took the attitude that, and then you're presenting how you've heard other people do it and then you knock it down. And there are ways of criticising people and telling them what to do when they're in the same room at the same time. And all you use is the word I and me and myself. But the real message, the message behind that is still control. I've got to really it's so hard. I would really watch that because I can tell by how I feel. If I have to ask a friend afterwards, was my share okay? I know it wasn't, or I wouldn't be asking. It almost always means that I was trying to telegraph some control of someone else's recovery, couching it in the politest possible way, and unimpeachable, irreproachable, and deadly, because everyone knows exactly what you're doing. Because I know when it's being done to me. And I've really got to watch that. That's one of the things I'm terrible at. But my Al-Anon home group is great because they let me stay even though I'm like that some of the time. And they just nod politely and then we have yet another reading. And I think the reason we have all the readings is because we're just too dangerous to be left to just speak. At least if there are lots of readings, there's just less scope for introducing your own ideas. Someone tried to introduce some yoga breathing or something into my Al-Anon home group, and then there was a reading, so everyone forgot about it. It was great. So there we go. That's over to you.
It's very interesting. We had at one Al-Anon meeting, one of the members thought she'd read her own poetry. Enough said. It was suddenly a very long meeting. This is the first tradition as it's read the long form. Each member of AA is but a small part of a great whole. AA must continue to live, or most of us will surely die. Hence, our common welfare comes first, but individual welfare follows close afterward. Short form. Our common welfare should come first. Personal recovery depends upon AA unity. So philosophically, this is dealing with two goods: the common welfare and the individual welfare. These are both good things, but frequently they're at odds. And there's arguing and all sorts of things. If you're an alcoholic or a drug addict, you've never thought about the common welfare for 10 seconds in your whole life. It's all you. As long as I get my way now, the world's beautiful. And the fact that you might have to let someone else go first or someone else take a turn or be inconvenienced is a crisis. Yesterday I mentioned my therapist for a while, Dr. Geraldine Fink, and we talked about recovery. Mostly we just talked about me, but every so often we would talk about recovery. And she said one of the things she noticed about heroin addicts recovering is if your shoelace breaks or if your spouse is in the emergency room, it's the same crisis. An inability to say this is important and that's not important. An inability to say this is big, that everything is a crisis. And if everything is a crisis, the common welfare is going to take some real knocks. The common welfare. Confucius writes about this. Dare I say, Moses writes about this. Aristotle writes about this. It's part of the conversation as a society forms and develops and grows. What's the common welfare? One simple example of this, in the group, do we celebrate holidays or not? Especially when there's many different holidays. More gut-wrenching was the smoking wars. And this was a real hot issue for a long time. Because in meetings, everyone smoked all the time. If you look at movies from the 1940s and 50s and 60s, everyone's smoking all the time. It's what we do. And I used to be one of those people. And if you'd have a meeting, this row here is non-smoking and everyone else is smoking their heads off, figuring the smoke will know not to go there, you know. It's like I'm only peeing in my part of the pool. What's the problem with everyone else? So smoking wars. And you have a meeting now and it's half smoking and half not smoking. And we're going to vote next week on whether we should be a smoke-free meeting. And there's 10 people at the meeting. The next week, 300 people at the meeting show up, all with cigars. And they will fight to keep this a smoke. And it just became nuts. And trust me, fist fights in the parking lot, people chased out of meetings, arguments between best of friends who never spoke to each other for years. It was a great shock. Until a lot of people died. Emphysema, lung cancer. A lot of people died. And the notion developed that the common welfare is that people can breathe. That's the common welfare. And so some things really take time to chew on and think about. How to make the meeting safe, how to make the meeting secure, how to make the meeting reliable. And it can go in lots of different directions. One more short story, then it's your turn. I went to a meeting in a rural California town. I was visiting family. I really needed the meeting. It was around the holidays, and people were very freaked out. My oldest brother married into a very complicated Italian family. Is that redundant? A complicated Italian family? But it really was, with people who had a lot of issues. And I was not comfortable. My parents were there. They were trying to be nice. I really needed the meeting, and I went to this meeting. I said, I'll be back. I went to a meeting, and it was in this rural area of Northern California. There was we would call this person a good old boy, farmer, man of the earth, redneck perhaps from being out in the sun so much, but a good old boy. This is a regular citizen, and much life and culture comes from people like this. Perhaps even salt of the earth, good old boy. And he was the secretary for the meeting. Clearly he was a farmer, just in his attitude. And then there was a young woman there who was visiting family, and her eyes were just wide like that. So you knew she was visiting family. And then there was a young man who was obstreperous, difficult, jumpy, irritated. And the meeting started, and we read something, and then, does anyone have a topic? There's 4 of us at the meeting. And the young man said, yes. Why won't they let me bring my knife into the meeting? That was the topic. And the good old boy said, Son, none of us brings our knives into the meeting for the common welfare. And he could hear that. And I just said, this is a guy with common sense. I would be happy to listen to him talk about more stuff. But again, common welfare. And it develops and it evolves and things change all the time. But regularly, this can be a discussion.
Three points on tradition one. How I can practice tradition one. I forgot a pen and piece of paper. If someone could lend me one for later on, that would be very helpful. The first point is when I'm sharing, in the Al-Anon Green and White book, the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, there is a very interesting passage at the end of tradition one, essentially about don't bring just your mess and war story to the meeting and trot out that. You want to try and deal with that maybe with your friends in Al-Anon and your sponsor, but try to bring a message of hope and a solution. Now, my experience, sometimes this can be taken to an extreme, and if someone shares a problem or a difficulty, people will pounce on and say, well, you shouldn't share that, it'll scare the newcomer. What I do, and it's just what I do, is if I've got a problem and I just need to talk about it, it's fine. But what I can do at the same time is say, this is my problem and this is how I'm dealing with it. These are the actions I'm taking and these are the results that I'm getting. And then you've got the full picture, what I was like, what happened and what I'm like now. It's not just presenting a sort of shiny, finished version, and it's not just trotting out the problem. And sometimes when it's just a war story, a drinking war story or an Al-Anon war story, or it's just all the things that they are doing which make me feel ... I feel the air being sucked out of the room. But when there's just a tiny little bit, sometimes the share is 90% that, but then a tiny little bit, but I called my sponsor and I went to a meeting and I said a prayer and I paused and I paused and I paused and then it's enough. And then suddenly a channel seems to open between them and literally everyone else in the room. What separates me from other people is the biographical detail of all the clutter of my life, which I think is causing my problem. But the application of the program to that clutter is something I can share with everyone else. And to me, that's how I can practice the common good. Another thing about how meetings are structured. I live in a part of London where there's quite a high concentration of people who struggle to get through the day. There are people that struggle crossing the road. There are people that struggle with all sorts of really basic things. There's a very high quotient of mental illness and other stuff and social problems. My other half calls them psychosocial complexities. There is a lot going on in the room, and lots of people are in their 20s and got into recovery in their 20s because things were not great before they started drinking and using, which is why the drinking and using got them to burn out so quickly. So the room can be very complicated, and there's usually one or two people who are psychotic, one or two people who are schizophrenic, and everyone gets to share. Even if it makes no sense, people don't form a little line afterwards and tell them you shouldn't share that. But what we do have is a little bell that goes off after 2 minutes or 3 minutes, which is a sign you're going to let someone else have a go now. Thank you so much, but let's let someone else have a go. And it's such a beautiful system because when it's a bell, there are other ways of limiting the sharing time, like raising a card or something, which, like in football, I don't like it. And also, people can pretend they haven't seen it. Or sometimes they literally don't see it because all they can think about is 1974, which is what they're sharing about. So a card, no card, they don't know. But a bell, One of those little Buddhist singing bowls, everyone hears that. And so, it's clear what's going on. And there's a limit to how much damage someone can do in 2 or 3 minutes. 10 minutes is a different matter, but 2 or 3 minutes, the group can somehow sustain it. And like dough folding over on itself, the dough is cut, but then it coalesces again. 2 or 3 people will come in afterwards, and then the waters are smoothed. So people can let out the wild horses because the paddock has strong fences. And that's what allows the wild horses to be let out and tamed. And I had a third point about tradition 1, and it's gone, and I don't care. So.
I'll take that as, I think that's God's will. We've been going almost an hour. Why don't we take a 15-minute break? And then when we come back, happy to take a couple of questions, literally about anything, because we are experts on virtually everything. But happy to take questions, and if not, we'll continue wandering through some recovery stuff. Okay.
And you can write some questions on a piece of paper at the front as well if you value anonymity.
Thank you.